this is the Provoked Prawn, and I've built an RGB-tastic Corsair 5000D RGB Airflow case, and I want to talk to you about what I've done, why, and show you the build process for it. Now, I've done videos previously on the 5000D Airflow. I've actually done quite a few different setups, but in this one, I'm focusing on the RGB side of things. I've actually gone for what is fairly straightforward setup as well. So Corsair was kind enough to send over various different parts. So I've crafted this build with a Gigabyte 4070 Ti, an AMD board, and other things. But in the past, I've built the Airflow with a number of different setups. So I built it one time with just the two pre-included basic fans that it originally came with. And then I popped in loads of fans and I did a build with 12 fans in it, if I recall correctly. It was insane from multiple angles. You can see lots of intake, and the radiator also had push-pull set up on it, so it was pretty intense. But in this build, I'm doing things a little bit more straightforward. Now, this is a new and improved RGB Airflow case from Corsair that comes pre-installed with AF120 RGB Elite fans. I've done videos separately on these fans and how to set them up and wire them. And that's going to be the theme for a lot of this video, because I've also basically crafted videos on every single component in this build. So you'll be able to see a lot more, and I'll mention that and I'll leave links in the description so you can find out more about each of these things in depth. But this is actually going to be a fairly in-depth video because I want to talk through the build process, all the elements of it, what I've done, the logic of it, the things that you could potentially do with the case. I'm not going to go into as much depth. So this case is actually pretty flexible in what you can do with it. You can install a lot of SSDs in it, a lot of hard disk drives, but I already covered that in the previous video, so I'll link to that in the description. If you're planning on adding in hard disk drives, SSDs, maybe even liquid cooled systems, then check out the links in the description to my 5000T video and the previous 5000D, where I went into a bit more depth and all these things. But here I'm actually going to make a really straightforward build, despite what you've seen at the beginning with all the RGB, although you will see a lot of cables at the rear of the case by the end of it. Now, this is a really nice case. I've built in it several times now, and I really like the overall design and thought process that Corsair has put into it. There's a number of really nice things to it. You can see, for example, once you get that rear panel off, you not only have room for fans, as you saw earlier on, that you can side mount, but you also have a PWM controller, RGB hub, and a lighting node pre-installed and set up and ready to go in there. And the AF120 RGB Elite fans that are installed on the front of the case are already plugged into the PWM controller and the Corsair RGB hub. So it's actually all set up. You basically just need to plug in a few different cables, and I'm going to talk through the process there to basically get those running immediately. So in theory, you don't need to add too much more to this build in order to set it off. And the fact that it comes with 3 RGB fans and very good quality ones is also beneficial. But you can see the PWM controller has the ability to have 6 fans, so you could put 3 more in there, and then you just got to connect up these things. Now, it's worth noting that you have the LED node, the RGB hub, and the PWM controller. So the controller does the fan speed, and that requires SATA power and a connection to the motherboard to control that. You then have the RGB lighting from the fans going to the RGB hub, and then that connects up to the LED node, which then has a USB connection to your motherboard and SATA power. A lot of cables in here. It is maybe a little bit overwhelming. I've done a video separately on the AF120 Elite fans, which will help if you're a bit confused by the wiring logic of how to set these fans up. Can be a bit intimidating, especially when you start looking at the cables. You see you've got 3 SATA connections and the USB connection. Don't worry, I'm going to talk through all those things as we go through. Now, as I said, I'm going to strip this down and I'm going to set it up with what I need to, because I want to build this for a specific purpose, and I'm going to show off what that is later. So subscribe to see more about why I'm building this RGB build. But what you can see is I've stripped out the hard disk drive cage. I'm also doing things like preparing the cable management. So you see it's got some nice cable management channels along the top and sides, and it has these nice Velcro ties that you can run through the loops in there as well. So you can basically prepare for all the cables that are going to go in there. And we're going to end up with a lot of cables in here by the end of it. By the way, watch out for Corsair's IQ Link setup that they're running and going to be releasing later this year, which is going to be pretty epic, where they're basically making modular cables for your fans and connectors at the back that should make this cable management a lot nicer. They've just shown that off recently at Computex, and it's coming, and I'm very excited. It's going to be awesome. But in this build, I'm using the Gigabyte X670 Gaming X AX motherboard, AMD Ryzen 7 770 CPU, and a crucial T700 PCIe Gen 5 NVMe SSD, as well as a Corsair NVMe SSD as well. So it's basically going to be a really fast build and a very nice one with some nifty features. And this is a reasonably affordable AMD motherboard, but it has a Gen 5 PCIe NVMe slot at the top just below the CPU. It's DDR5 RAM compatible, and it's obviously AM5, so there's going to be a setup process in here. And I'll leave all the specs in the description of this build so you can find out what I've used. And if you want to find out more about those or consider purchasing them, then you'll be able to find out the details down there. I'm also going to do separate videos of all these things, including the motherboard. So subscribe if you haven't already to see those. But you'll see lots of I/O on this, lots of connectivity, and plenty going on here. It also has support for multiple NVMe SSDs. So if you're going the way I am with 2, 3 or more NVMe SSDs, this could be useful. So I've got the T700, which is obviously the fast one, and then the Corsair, which is 2 terabytes, and should also provide plenty of space. As I said, DDR5, which means you can also use Corsair's Vengeance RAM, as you've seen. Now, I've done a video separately on the crucial T700, but I want to show it off here because it is a potential awesome bit of kit. This is a 12,000 megabytes per second read-write speed drive. I've done some tests on it. It runs really hot, but it's also blisteringly fast. For reference, Gen 4 drives top out around 7,000 megabytes per second, so this thing is insanely fast. Now, this Gigabyte board also has a really easy setup for the installation. It has a Q latch, so there's a little plastic latch that you can pull off and lift up, and then it clips back down. A little bit fiddly, but there's no screw required, so the installation of the drive is really straightforward. From a different angle, though, you can see just how chunky this is, and that's because this drive actually is designed in a way that it runs so fast it gets very hot, and if it gets too hot it will thermally throttle and then performance will be lacking. Of course, the MP600 Core XT is a Gen 4 drive, so it's not as fast, but it's still going to be pretty capable and very nice. And this will also install on the Gigabyte motherboard as well, because there's multiple M2 slots on here. Now, I often use in my main build 2 or more drives for various different reasons. You could have one for your Windows operating system for the boot drive, where all your software and apps and things go. Another one for games. And then I personally use one for obviously recording video footage, putting that on there, capturing gameplay footage and other things. It's nice to separate out those drives. If you're moving files around, it makes it nice and fast, but also just means that I know where everything is. It's stored really nicely. And the difference with this one, obviously, is that I've got one Gen 5 drive that's going to be blisteringly fast, and then one Gen 4. But you can see underneath the heatsink down here, there's access to 3 other M2 ports on there as well. So you've got plenty of room to add in extra M2 NVMe SSDs if you want to. And these are great because they don't require any cables, no fiddling with power cables and data cables and connecting those up to your power supply unit and the motherboard. They just simply connect up to the motherboard. You just need to remember to remove the stickers, ensure the thermal pads have good contact, and then set those up. By the way, side note, you'll notice I didn't remove the sticker off the drive. I've done a video separately on whether you should remove the sticker from your NVMe SSD, and the conclusion from that was you shouldn't. But if you want to find out more about that, go and check that out. Most companies just tell you not to. Also, it doesn't make much difference in terms of the thermal performance, and some of those stickers are actually useful for the thermal conductivity as well, so that's worth noting. Now, I'm using Corsair Vengeance RGB RAM. This is DDR5 RAM. It's 32 gigabytes, 6,200 mega transfers a second, and it has some nice RGB lighting, as you saw from the clips at the beginning. Now, I'm going to go through all the steps of installing all this. If you don't want to see all that, then come back for more in the future on just what I'm doing with this build, because there's a reason I built this RGB build. I'm going to be showing off even more RGB in a full-on setup in the near future, and what you can do with it, because it's more than just lighting up your case in various different ways. You can also make it reactive and basically make your gaming space really interesting. But if you're installing 2 sticks of RAM, you want to use A2 and B2, which is the second slot in away from the CPU, and then the 4th slot. This is for dual channel RAM. It ensures that everything's running smoothly. I've done a video separately on what to do with your RAM and the logic of the installation and things to avoid, mistakes to avoid. Now I'm using the Corsair iQ H150i Elite Cappelix XT. I've done a setup guide separately on this in the past that I'll link to in the description, where I went into full depth on it in terms of setting it up with Intel, the fan logic and all the other things, but I am going to demonstrate a lot of that now anyway and go into that. But if you want to find out more about that, the benchmarks, how to set it up on the software and other things, be sure to check out that full video as well. You'll see it comes pre-applied with thermal paste, and it's also set up for Intel as a standard out of the box. So actually the bracket that's on there is ready for Intel, and we're doing an AMD build here, so we will need to remove that later on. It also has this sort of flat connector and some other cables that come out of it and connect up to the commander core and to your motherboard. So there are some important points to bear in mind there. This uses the same fans that we already have pre-installed in the case, which is perfect. Obviously, we've got a nice white cooler. We've got the white AF120 RGB Elite fans, and that setup's going to make it look really nice fit with the case. But this is a multi-capable cooler. It'll work with all sorts, Intel, AMD, AM4 and AM5. So this is an AM5 socket, and it will work with that as well. And I'm going to show you the setup process for that, but you'll find that there are brackets included here. Obviously, this is an AMD build, so I'm going to be focusing on the AMD part of it. I've done installations for Intel in the past, so really straightforward for either of them and really nice for AM5. You have these new standoffs which work with AM4 and AM5, and there are some points of note there I'll talk about a bit later on. Now I'm going to be using this radiator top mounted, as you saw earlier on in the video, where I'm going to be putting the fans face down into the case, which is actually better for the RGB lighting, but also means we're going to be pulling air up through the radiator and exhausting out the top of the case. I'll use the front 3 fans as they're already set up in the case as intake, and then I'm going to exhaust out of the radiator here and out the rear of the case as well. I've tested a few different setups in terms of radiator positioning, and this is a pretty optimum and gives good airflow and good aesthetics, so it's a nice balance, especially here where I'm only going to be using 7 fans. So I've got 3 on the radiator, 1 on the case at the back, and then 3 that are already pre-installed. This makes the setup process pretty straightforward and relatively easy, hassle-free. Now, the other thing that I noted earlier on is that it is possible to do push-pull setup on this. So you will notice that you have a lot of these long radiator screws included in the box. They actually include enough in there that you can do push-pull, and I have shown in the previous video on this case that it's possible to put fans on top of the case and then mount them through the case into the radiator on top, and then put fans below that, put them in the same direction, and you can pull air through in there and basically double the amount of airflow going through. So if you want to do it, you can do it, and the Commander Core XT that's included with it allows you to easily do this and control all those fans in a nice way. So it's pretty straightforward and simple. If you're a bit flush with cash and you want to do it, that is an option. It can potentially get a little bit noisy. At least it did in the build that I did previously, but that was with different fans, so it's worth noting that. So as standard for the basic installation, which is what we're going to stick to here, just basically using those radiator screws, pass through into the radiator and then screw them down, secure the fans into place. And then obviously we've got 2 cables from each of the fans that we need to deal with. So we'll get to that in a minute, but again, the wiring can seem a bit intimidating, and there are different options. So I've gone with one setup. You may go for another. I personally find it's best to try and keep the logic of the fans that are on the radiator sort of in line with what's going on in sort of CPU pump head to make sure that system's sort of closed off. So in this case, I'm going to basically be using the fans that are included in here with the Commander Core and sticking to that, and then use the case fans with the PWM controller, just so we have them separated and easy to control in iQ. Cooler comes with the Commander Core, which is a RGB and fan power controller. So you have 2 connections, one on the left, one on the right, one for RGB, one for fan power. You can't get these the wrong way around. Essentially, you need to obviously connect up each of these. Now, I recommend when you're doing it that you do it in a logical order. So assume that you're going to be running your fans in your case in a way where you want the lighting sequence to go from one fan to the next. This is at hardware level, but it is all customizable in the iQ software, and I have shown that in a video on this. Essentially, you can set it up so that the sequence of RGB will run across multiple fans, and you can adjust it within the software. You'll notice that the pump head also has a connector that connects up to the Commander Core, and then there's another cable which runs to either the CPU fan header or the all-in-one pump header on your motherboard. On this motherboard, there is no all-in-one pump header, so we're just going to run it to the CPU fan connector, which is in the top right here. You see CPU fan and CPU optional there in the top right, and we go for CPU fan. If you had an all-in-one pump, you might want to go for that instead, but this will work just as well. And then obviously this is going to seat down over the CPU once we've installed it. And we've got the pre-applied thermal paste, so you don't need to worry about that. Make sure that you keep the plastic cover on in the meantime. Obviously, I need to change out the brackets. I'm going to leave that until later on because I damaged the thermal paste on one of these coolers in the past by being a bit too keen on that, so don't make the same mistakes as me. Now, for this AM5 setup, in this cooler, we need to remove the pre-installed brackets that come with the Gigabyte motherboard. So you take off the screws there and then remove these plastic clips. Previously with AM4, you'd sort of run the cooler onto there and then hook it onto the clips. It was a pain. This new setup makes life a little bit easier. One thing that isn't obvious though, so watch out for this if you are copying this build or doing a similar one, is that the standoff screws that you can see here are actually ever so slightly thicker on one side than they are on the other. That fat side is meant to screw into the motherboard here, so you need to make sure you position them the right way around, because if you put the thin end in, that won't screw in properly. It'll end up spinning. It won't connect up properly when you put the pump head down on top. You won't get a good seating and you won't get good coverage. So just keep that in mind, because I have actually experienced that problem, so don't make that same mistake. Just watch out for the standoffs, but it's really difficult to see the difference between them. It's not noticeably fatter. It's not much fatter. It's just ever so slightly the case, so just watch out because it could be easy to accidentally miss that. But you basically align those up and then screw them down into place, and this is essentially preparing everything. So you want to do as much preparation before we go into building the case beforehand and setting up and getting ready so that you can then obviously go about installing everything once it's built. And I'm showing you all this now outside the case as well, so it's a lot more visible. In terms of the CPU mounting, fairly straightforward, but the AMD setup now works very similarly to Intel. So you remove this housing, you'll notice that the motherboard has the pins on it. So when you're installing the CPU, you need to be very gentle. Place it in there very gently, line up the little clips, make sure it's seated the right way around, looking at the gold arrow that points up into the corner, and then gently push the lever down until that top cap pops off, and then hook it back down. You need to be very careful not to damage the pins when you're putting this in. So you saw how gentle I was with placing that in there, and then that should ensure that everything runs nice and smoothly. And then for this build, I'm using the Corsair RM Shift series. This is a 1000 watt power supply unit. And now I'm going to show you what to do, where to plug cables in, what's included in the box, and how to set it up. I'm also going to be showing off the modular premium power supply cables from Corsair, because they're pretty snazzy and well worth considering as well. But I'm going to start with a standard installation, to talk through all the different steps and things to bear in mind while installing the cables and the thought process behind it. It's worth noting that the RM Shift, if you're not aware already, is a slightly different variant to Corsair's usual power supply lineup, in that the connectors are actually on the side, which means they face towards the rear of the case rather than out the back, which will make sense when you see it at the end. But essentially, these will run along the back panel of the case, where all the motherboard base and other things sit, and all the cable channeling, which in theory makes it easier to manipulate the cables and set them up in a nice way. Now, this is a PCIe Gen 5 compatible power supply unit, which means that it comes with a lot of cables. These are Type 5 cables as well, so they're actually smaller than the standard cables you might well be used to. The connector that connects up to the power supply unit is actually tinier, and that's pretty interesting. But you'll see there is modular, so you do have connectors in a variety of different ways, and they're all nicely labeled so you know where to plug things in. But I'm going to show you where to connect up every little thing you will need for your PC build. I'll start things off with the motherboard. Now I'm going to show you these things outside the case so it's easier to see where things are plugged in and you get a clearer picture of what to do. Obviously, you'd actually do this when it's all installed in the case, which I'll show you at the end. I'm going to start with the 24-pin power supply unit for the motherboard. This plugs in on the right-hand side of the motherboard. You can see it's clearly marked on the PSU as well. It says motherboard there. There are actually 3 connectors in that surrounding area. The cable itself only has 2. You'll see it's split into 2 parts on the power supply end. Now, you can't actually get this cable the wrong way around, because the end that connects to the motherboard itself is actually fatter. So the connectors that connect up there are larger style. The Type 5 connectors that connect to the PSU are of a smaller size, smaller form factor. So you'll see that they just push in to the relevant parts here, and you can just copy what I'm doing. The little one goes just below that longer one there and plugs in. Obviously you have to make sure these are properly seated. You'll notice there's a little clip on the top of each of them that pushes into a relevant hole on the PSU, and that ensures that it's fully secured. And then the other end plugs into the motherboard on the right hand side here. It's really important this cable's fully connected. If it isn't seated properly, your motherboard and your computer will not turn on, it will not power on. That's one of the most important cables to install. Obviously you have to make sure you install them all correctly and seat them correctly, but this one is essential. The next up is the CPU power cables. You can see them clearly marked CPU. Again, you'll see there's a difference between the end that connects to the motherboard and the end that connects to the power supply unit. Is significantly smaller on the PSU, so you can't get these wrong. Here we're looking for the PCIe/CPU markings, and we want to plug the Type 5 end into there. Now you'll generally find that you have 1 or 2 CPU power connectors for your motherboard, and they're often in the top left position. Sometimes you might find 3 on the more extreme end motherboards, but generally speaking it's just 2, and so you run these cables up to the top. Again, I'm demonstrating this outside the case. You would not do this once you first unbox the power supply unit. You want to make sure you build it in the case this way, and I'll show you that later, but I just want to make it easier to see. And once again, you can only plug these in one way because they have a clip on top which basically hooks over the socket on the motherboard, and once you push that down you should feel a nice little click in there, and then it'll seat down in place. The thing you'll notice about these cables is also really flat. They're long and they're flat, which means that they should squash nicely up against the back of your case, and should be easy to cable manage as well, so you've got a nice neat setup in the case too. Next up is the SATA connectors. There are loads of these included in the box. You'll see those are daisy chainable cables, basically have multiple connections on them. You've got the Type 5 connector that connects up to the SATA/PATA connectors up here in the top row, and a tiny little 6-pin connector that plugs in there, and then this gives you multiple connections for various different devices. So for example, you can use it with a Corsair Commander Pro or a Commander Core, and that requires SATA power. This is a fan controller, does fan and RGB control on the various different Corsair fans, and the connector plugs in there. Now this has an L-shaped connector to it, very small L shape to it, so it only connects up one way, but I always get it the wrong way around, so don't worry if you do. You will not be able to plug it in incorrectly. Now this cable is also daisy chainable, so there's multiple connectors on it, so you can theoretically use it with other things too, which means that you connect up hard disk drives, SSDs, RGB controllers, fan controllers, all sorts of things require SATA power. These connect up to this really easily. You can just push them in and connect that up, and you can in theory run multiple devices off of one cable with relative ease as well. So you can see in the example here just those 2 things, but we could add in more. You can see there's still spare connectors on that cable, so it's important to work out how many cables you're going to be using. For example, I have this NZXT USB hub which allows you to connect up 4 different USB connectors to one single USB on your motherboard. That also has a SATA power connector, and again we can connect that up to the same cable, so now we could have 3 cables on there. Alternatively, if you wanted to be a bit more secure and think about sort of the power usage from each of these cables, you could use another one, because there are loads of these cables included in the box as you've seen, so you've got plenty of different SATA connectors that you can use with relative ease. The next one is probably not going to be used in most builds, and this connector is essentially used for older things, DVD drives, SSDs, but also pump reservoir combos from full custom liquid loop systems. So that is also powered by the PATA/SATA section. So it's a peripheral connector essentially, and again this is daisy chain, so you can see that this has multiple connections on it. There's 2 of those cables included in the box, so if you do need them you do have the option to add in multiple different ones and use those relatively easily too. So a nice lot of connectors, and again nice flat connection as well. You can see here from a Corsair 5000T that I did a while ago with that combo reservoir here that has the power connector on the bottom. Next is the graphics card connectors, PCIe connectors, and I'm going to show you both NVIDIA's 30 series and 40 series GPUs and the different logic for that. So this is a standard sort of original setup that you'll probably be used to. This is a Type 5 connection on one end, and on the other end it has a sort of pigtail setup, so you've got two PCIe 8-pin connectors on there, split into two there. And there's different cables included in the box. This is worth watching out for, because you'll see that there's two of those pigtail ones with the split, but then you've got three single ones. So this is basically one cable plugs into the power supply unit, and then one connector, which is 8-pin, up to the graphics card. So if you've got a GPU like I have, and this is a Gigabyte 3090 OC Vision card, you'll see it has two power connectors on it. So it requires two 8-pin power connectors. You may well have a card that has three, perhaps, and then you can use those three separate cables. So the best course of action is to use these individual ones. You have to push the two pins together, and then you've got it into an 8-pin connector, and then plug that in. But this is that individual one rather than the other one that has that sort of pigtail, which is theoretically possible to daisy chain connectors up with. But really, if you want to make sure you've got the best possible power, you use these single connectors. And you'll see you just push those in, make sure you slot it all in so that both parts of that are seated properly, because if you've got one that's loose, then it won't power on. And then you've just got two connectors that connect up to the power supply unit. So this is obviously for 30 series cards. That's the logic you'd use for NVIDIA's 30 series cards, and for AMD GPUs as well, and Intel. And you basically connect up the other end to the PCIe/CPU connectors here that you'll see. Now, obviously, that logic's fairly straightforward. If you've got 3 or 4 connectors on your GPU, it might be a bit more complicated. But obviously, as you've seen, this PSU comes with 3 of these style of cables. So you've got plenty of cables there that you can use. And then you just maybe have to go for the daisy chain one if you've got more. But you should find that you can basically have this set up. Fairly straightforward, straight connections, nice and neat as well on the end that plugs into the graphics card, which is pretty cool. Now we go on to the 40 series card. So this is a Gigabyte 4070 Ti, which comes in the box as standard with this NVIDIA adapter, which is a special connector that has one cable that connects up to the power supply unit. It's different. You can see close up here that it has some extra pins on the top. It's a bit more fiddly. You need to make sure it's seated properly and pushed in. The thing about this connector is it's also messy. But basically what it does is it allows you to push this in and then connect it up to 2 8-pin power supply cables. Now, traditionally, what you would have done with an older generation of PSU is you'd plug this end into here, and then you have those standard cables that I showed you a minute ago that you connected up directly to the 3090. They would connect up instead to this adapter. So again, you'd use those straight single cables, push the pins together and put it all in. You can see this ends up then looking a bit messy. You could do this logic if you want to, but you actually have a cable included in the box, which makes things a lot easier. So you can get rid of this mess, unclip it, and instead we're just going to use this dedicated cable, which essentially is a similar logic, but it cuts out that middleman of the adapter, because it basically just plugs straight into the GPU, and then the other end, those 2 connectors plug into the PSU, and that'll be enough to power the 40 series graphics cards and makes things nice and neat. You can also see it's really flexible. It's a nice flexible cable, so it should be easy to manipulate around, and it's long as well, so you shouldn't have any issues with it. Be very careful with this cable. Make sure it's plugged in fully at both ends, both to the graphics card and to the power supply unit, because there were problems with some of the cards melting initially with the 40 series and the top end, the flagship 4090, because people weren't plugging it in properly. Then you obviously need to plug in all your cables and put it in the case. But now another step I'm going to show you, which isn't essential, but is a nice upgrade if you want to do it. This is Corsair's Pro Kit, which is essentially a premium single-sleeved, individually sleeved power supply cables. They are Type 5 cables still, so they have the same logic with the small connectors on one end and then the traditional ones on the other. And they are really nice looking, and they're a nicer setup with some cable combs, so you can make them look theoretically nicer. Here you can see I've sorted out the box. I'll leave links in the description so you can find out the official thing. But there are loads of cables included in the box, but once I've whittled them down, these are the ones that I need. So you've got that standard connector for the graphics card that I showed you a minute ago. Then you've got obviously the motherboard and CPU connectors, a single SATA connector. And that's one thing to note, is that it lacks as many SATA connectors as the standard one, but that doesn't matter because you can still use the ones that come included with the power supply at the back if you want to. But here you can see you've got a nice, neat setup. Plug all those cables in so it's ready to go, and then put it into your case. I'm using the Corsair 5000D for demonstration purposes here. But you can see what I was talking about earlier. So instead of the cables coming out the front towards the front of the case, towards the hard disk drives, they now come out a rear panel here, and then you can then run them into the case. And I'll show you that in a second. You have 4 screws included with the power supply that screw into the relevant holes when you line it up at the back of the case. You will have noticed that I also made sure that the case was fanned down towards the bottom. That's because that's an intake fan, pulls air up from the bottom of the case and then blows out the rear where the power button is to turn it on. So the next stage here is to then run those power supply cables from where they're mounted in the PSU through the various channeling loops. So this is what paid off from earlier on when I put in those cable ties in the various different spots, because now I can run the 24 pin and the PCIe Gen 5 connector on the left hand side, and on the right I'll run the 2 8-pin CPU power connectors up through there. I also noticed that I'm connecting up the SATA power connections on here as well, and there's a variety of those now because we have a lot of different devices in here, and more on that in a minute because there are a lot of connections that you need to make sure you're setting up. Now I'm going to mount the motherboard into the case as well, and fairly straightforward because all the standoffs in there are already set up for an ATX motherboard, so it's really easy to do. Just got to line up that back I/O with there and then just gently put it into place, and then screw all the relevant standoff screws in. These are included with the case as well. They were in that little cardboard box that you saw me pull out earlier on. So just quickly obviously going through the installation process there and the setup and screwing that all down. Now we've got that motherboard seated, we're going to connect up the power cables. It's important to do this now for the power cables from the power supply unit, because once you go about mounting the cooler, as we will move to the top of the case, things will get a lot more fiddly. So connect up those 2 8-pin CPU power connectors to the top left, basically push them into place, manipulate those cables around. The next one is, I noticed here that the cables from the fans are a little bit sort of floppy. And what you'll notice is that there's some cable loops on the fan tray near the rear of the case. So what you can do is you can pop off the bottom and then you can remove the thumb screws. They're a bit tight, so I had to use a screwdriver, but you can remove those and then pull that fan tray out. You can obviously then change the fans if you want to, but what I'm doing here is essentially I'm using the plastic cable ties that are included to then just tidy things up a bit. You can tighten up the cables obviously because they're all running to the back already. Basically tie these up a bit more, hide them out of the way, and if you can reach, you can also reach those cable loops on the rear of the case and tie the cables down to it as well once you've got this in place. If you're using scissors like I am, take great care not to cut through the power cables while you're doing this, because that's very easy to do if you're using massive scissors like I foolishly am, and then use basically seating this back. Now obviously you want to make this as neat as possible. There are various holes that you could run those power cables through, but you would have to disconnect them from the PWM controller and other things, so it becomes a little bit more fiddly. Now I'm going to run those cables through, so obviously the 24-pin power cable has to go through to the front and connect up to the motherboard. I've already shown the standard installation, but with this premium sleeved one, you have to do a little bit of fiddling around to try and get it looking nice, because it's a little bit tight to come through that cable tray, and then obviously you've got to manipulate the cable combs and other things. Then we have the USB-A and USB-C connections. This is for the top panel for the USB connections on the top of the case. So we need to push those into the right place as well and manipulate those through these couple of holes. You see the USB-C connector goes roughly where the 24-pin power connector is. It's just below the RAM on the right-hand side. I haven't actually run it through the right spot here. You might run it a bit further down. We obviously want to keep things nice and neat. And then we have the fat USB-A connector. This plugs in the bottom right there. There's actually 2 places where you can do this 3.2 USB connector on this motherboard. You'll notice there's another one in the bottom middle near where the internal USB connections go. But I'm going to run it through this neat one because that makes things a little bit neater. And then once the USB-C is in a good position, we can push that into place as well. Then you'll notice there's a little bit tidier now because I've run it a bit lower down, so it's worth keeping that in mind. And you'll see that we've got a lot of mess going on at the back here. And one of the things we've also got is a lot of other connectors to deal with. So one is the HD audio connector. This is the front panel 3.5mm connection. This goes to the F audio connector on the bottom left of the motherboard. This is the same from motherboard to motherboard, doesn't really matter which one you're using. It plugs in down there. And you can't get it the wrong way around because there's one pin missing, so you have to put it in one direction. You can't put it in any other. Then we have a fan power connector, which runs from the PWM controller. This is a simple connector that connects up to the system fan header on your motherboard somewhere. You then make sure it's got PWM control. That enables you to then have a control over the fan speed. I'm using the SysFan 3 header here, for example, because it's in a logical position, relatively easy to access. Now, the other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is this NZXT USB hub. This is an essential purchase. You can get a Corsair one. Unfortunately, I haven't got that one to demonstrate, but this is an internal hub which basically allows you to plug in 4 different USB connections to it and then run a single cable from it into the USB header on your motherboard. You'll see this motherboard only has 2 USB headers, and because of the sheer number of things we've got connected up, I actually have multiple different USB cables that need to connect up, so I can't possibly do this. We've got a display on the pump, we've got the cable comes out of the pump, we've got the commander core, we've got RGB nodes and other things, so there's multiple different USB connections, so using a splitter like this makes life a lot easier. I've done a video separately on why that's worthwhile, but it's definitely worth purchasing. Then you have the front panel connectors. Unfortunately, it wasn't easy to show these, but they go in the bottom right, and you're basically looking for the markings on the motherboard which demonstrate power LED, power switch, and reset switch. You'll see there are markings for plus and minus, so it basically tells you where to line up each of those connectors. Unfortunately, with the Corsair case, they're a little bit fiddly because they're split into individual ones, so it's one of the most painful parts of the build for most people, but there was no way for me to easily demonstrate that, unfortunately. Now for this build, I'm also running one AF120 RGB Elite fan at the rear. You can see, as I said earlier, I've got this set up for exhaust purposes. So I'm putting it this way where it basically faces into the case and then screwing it in from the rear. And then that has 2 cables. Now I noted earlier that what I'm going to do is essentially run the front fans and this rear fan from the PWM controller. That then gives me separate control over those versus the ones that are with the cooler. So it should make things a little bit more straightforward. So just running that through, setting those cables up at the rear and connecting them up in a second. But you can see that you have the ability to basically hide things away quite neatly there. And then obviously we've got that good cable management channeling that we can also run the cables through, make the most of those Velcro ties. There are multiple plastic cable ties and there are loops for doing it as well. But I'm using the cable ties that are included with Velcro ties because it's a little bit easier if you need to undo things. But the RGB connection goes to the RGB hub, and then the fan power connector goes to the PWM controller, and you just plug those in a logical way. Obviously, it'll be the 4th fan in the system that we've connected up to these 2, so just plug it into the 4th position. And then I'm just starting to tidy things up a bit because you can see we're obviously getting more and more cables in here, and it's going to be important to keep things nice and neat. But what you will actually find is you can hide your cable shame away at the end, which is pretty magnificent and very handy, so stick with me to see that in a second. Next up, we're preparing the top of the case for the all-in-one cooler radiator mounting. Once you pop off the very top, you'll see that there's a magnetic dust cover up here, which obviously needs removing. Now, as I noted earlier on, there's actually enough space up here to mount fans above here as well, so that's an interesting idea as a concept. If you don't want fans inside your case, or if you want to do push-pull, you can put fans on top of the case, through into the radiator, which you're going to mount underneath, and then fans below that, and then connect them all up to the commander core, and then have them all sort of in a closed system to control the cooling. Now, another point of note is you're going to see me align the holes here with obviously the holes on the case. One thing that you need to do is to run the cables back through to the rear and while you're doing this. But I'll also notice that I made a mistake in here, and I want to note it so that you can apply the same logic when you're doing your build. You'll notice that when I'm installing the radiator, the tubes from the radiator to the pump head are very close to that rear fan. Now, if you are careful with your installation when you basically put in the tiny screws to mount the radiator to the top of the case, don't tighten them up too much, and then you can sort of adjust where the radiator sits in relation to the front. I actually ended up removing a couple of those screws because it made it easier to sort of push the rad towards the front a bit more, and this then gives a bit of space to that back fan. Now, obviously, you could alternatively flip the rad round the other way and have the tubes facing towards the front as another option. Now, for this cooler, I'm actually using the IQ LCD upgrade kit. I've done a video separately on this. Now, you can buy this cooler with the display already installed on it, but Corsair didn't have stock of that, so they sent me this kit separately. But that's fine because this is a nice little upgrade. So if you've already got the H150i Elite Cappelix and you want to upgrade it so you can have an LCD display on it, you can do. This display is actually magnificent as well because it will show you all sorts of things, including GPU and CPU temperatures, GIFs and other things. You can customize it within IQ software. I've done a detailed guide on this I'll link to in the description already. It is a nifty upgrade and it's really easy to do as well. So I'm going to show you the process for that here, but I'm not going to go into the software in this build guide. So if you should make sure you check out that video if you want to find out more. One point of note is that I will highly recommend peeling off the tape around the edges of it before you install it, because once you get it into the case, it becomes a lot more fiddly. That is a mission as well. I sped up that footage because it takes quite a while to just peel it off, and it's really fiddly, especially if you've not got long fingernails. Then you need to use the little Allen key to remove those screws around the top plate. Now, with this cooler, you can actually get some swappable plates that you can change on there if you don't want to do the LCD upgrade. It comes with 3 different displays that you can basically put on top, and like nice little printed logos. You can also 3D print your own. There are options out there from other companies as well. With this kit, it comes with several screws that you need to screw in and in place of that, because it basically is held in place with magnets. So these screws act as the sort of receiver for those magnets as it clips down on top. And you'll notice there's a little connector on there as well. So essentially what we're doing is just replacing the standard top of the pump with this display instead. And then it has obviously the cables coming out of it, which I'll show you the connection of in a second. And you can only orient this display round one way because it only clips on one way, because there's a hole where the tubes go. But you can obviously adjust the display in IQ software if you need to, so you can customize what that looks like. But the end result of it looks really nice, as you'll see in a minute, and you will have seen at the beginning. It's a very nice sort of upgrade kit for that, and it's equivalent to NZXT's Kraken Z73, for example. So it's one of my faves in terms of what you can do with this. But you will notice there are a lot of cables coming out of there. Again, might seem intimidating, but it's basically the same setup. You have that fat connector that connects up to the commander core, USB connection, so that was what I mentioned why we need the NZXT hub, and then obviously the CPU fan header, or all-in-one fan header connection that connects up to the motherboard. Now, this actually comes with a USB splitter. You can see it's got this cable that you connect up to this USB connection here, and that goes 2 into 1, so you can theoretically use this to then just connect up to the motherboard instead. You can see you've got a spare one, and that will be used for the commander core, as I'll show you in a second. So you don't necessarily need the NZXT hub depending on what you're adding in. I certainly did, because there is a lot going on in this RGB build. The more RGB you add in, the more controllers you need, the more USB connections you need. It becomes a bit of a mission. But here I'm just again showing you what you can do with this outside the case to make it the build a bit more logical for you. So obviously you wouldn't necessarily connect up the commander now, but you can see that has that USB connection as well. That plugs in, so now you've got 2 USB connections going into one that can then connect up to the motherboard. And obviously also the fans will connect up to that commander as well. Now back to the pump head. I said earlier on that we need to swap out the brackets for this because it comes pre-installed with Intel brackets. Luckily these just pop off with relative ease, as you can see. They just slide out, so they're really easy to remove and replace, and it's fairly straightforward to do that. But you have these straighter ones for AM4 and AM5 with AMD, and they just slide in, and make sure you push them in nice and tight, but they slide into either side, and then those will take the place of that, and then it basically then just seats down over the pump and screws down with the thumb screws into the 4 corners. Take care to do each of the 4 corners carefully. I'd recommend doing diagonally opposite to tighten them up and seat them down. You'll see that the cable's getting in a little bit of the way. They're quite fiddly. Now, one of the points of note, if you've not built like this before, is one of the issues that you may well come across is if your CPU runs too hot. There are some tests that you can do beforehand. Often you may find it's something simple, like you've either damaged the thermal paste or you've not seated the pump head down quite tight enough. So I'd recommend making sure that each of these thumb screws is tight, but not overly tight. So you have to tighten it up, but not so much that you're obviously forcing it, because you could potentially damage the motherboard if you do that with damaging those pins. But you need to just make sure that's tightened up. Then you've got that small little cable that connects up to the CPU fan header, as I said earlier on, or all-in-one pump head if you've got one of those instead. But in this case, it's just CPU fan. And then you've got to run this chunky cable to the rear. You can see what I was saying about how things become a little bit more fiddly once the radiator's mounted. It's quite actually difficult to get this cable to the back, especially fighting the shielding around the motherboard and trying to get that up there. Obviously, I've got to get that commander cable up there. I've got to get the USB cable up there to the back, and then run that around there. And once you've done it, it looks okay. And obviously I'm going to do some tidying, but it is a little bit fiddly. Now the cables from the radiator are running down to here. I've got the fan cables running down to the commander core. And once again, I'm plugging those in. Same sort of logic as we said earlier on. RGB on one side, fan power on the other. I'm only connecting up 3 fans here. You could, if you had push-pull, connect up 6 fans to it. So it takes 6 maximum. And then you obviously have the PWM controller as another option as well to add in more fans. But if you were doing push-pull on here, you could connect those up. Or if you were adding in just more fans in general, let's say to the side of the case in that rear panel, where I haven't put any on the left-hand side here, for example, you could put 3 in there and then you could connect those up to the commander. I showed that in the detailed guide on when I did 12 fans, but I wanted to keep things a little bit more simple with this build. And I'm also going to be using that space, as you'll see in a second. Here you can see a quick clip with what I was talking about earlier, with those tubes just being a bit close to the fan and how you can push it along. I wanted to make a point that you could just ease that out a little bit so it's not touching the fan. Obviously, you don't want the fan spinning up and hitting those. Now, these are the IQ LC100 lighting accent triangles. And once again, I've done a video on these separately in a lot more detail. But basically, this is a starter kit and an expansion kit. And I'm going to show some of the steps for it because these are nice little magnetic panels that fit perfectly with the 5000D because the case has obviously got a lot of metal in it in various different places and some open space if you're not using the fans on that side rear panel as I am. They basically connect up with magnets and they clip together in various different ways. But again, you have lots of controls in here. So you need 2 powered cables for basically more than a certain amount of triangles. So there are, I think it's 9. If you have 9 triangles, you need 1 power cable per set. So if you've got 2 sets, you need to make sure you've got a SATA connector on one of them. You then also have that lighting node. You've got a USB connection. So it looks like this. 1 triangle plugs in with the LED connection to the lighting node. So it's the LED core essentially, which has 2 connectors on it. You'll see that. And then that needs SATA power from your power supply unit. So again, more SATA connections. And then you have a USB connection that runs out of the top of this little control box to your USB header on your motherboard. So once again, into the NZXT USB hub in this case, or a splitter if you've happened to got one. There you can see there's a lot of these going on. Now, obviously, also, you've got 2 of these. We've got 2 triangles for this kit. You have to connect them both up because you need them for maximum power to ensure that all of them light up and can be controlled with IQ, because the more triangles you add in, the more power it needs. So if you're adding in 2 kits, you need 2 powered triangles. That's 3 SATA connections because you've got 1 for the controller and 2 for the triangles. So just bear that in mind because you can maybe need to add in some extra SATA cables for the power supply, which I actually did. So it's worth noting that you'll have seen that I've obviously got the premium cables connected up here, but I actually had to use the original cables that are included with the PSU as well for this because there was just so many SATA connections, what with the commander core and the LED nodes and the NZXT hub and other things. If you're adding in SSDs and hard disk drives as well, then it becomes a mission. You can also see I'm running out of space back here. Obviously, I've removed those SSD trays earlier on, but trying to work out where I'm going to position this extra core becomes a little bit problematic. I did think maybe I could get away with using the one that was pre-installed, but there's only 1 spare channel on that, so you can't do that. You obviously also can't plug it into the commander core or the RGB hub because it's a different connector. So unfortunately, you do need to use this. You need to work out where to install it. I thought about maybe putting it here on the back panel. This probably would have worked, except then I couldn't really easily connect up to the USB connection. You can see that cable's fairly short. So I ended up just sort of jamming it up the top there. But you do need to think about the positioning of it. It uses 3M stickers to stick to the rear. So you basically just put those on and then try and position it somewhere where it will conveniently work. There are plenty of different spots, as you can see. Obviously, also the bottom of the case, since I'm not using hard disk drives, you could jam it down there maybe. You do have options. Then we need to connect up that 1 cable to the core from the triangle. So you can see that I've run the 2 in there, but basically I'm running that across and then down to the bottom of the case where that fan tray sits, where the cable management tray sits at the very bottom of that. Because the idea here is that once I put on the bottom panel, hopefully I'll be able to hide that power cable away a little bit and neaten things up. And then I'm essentially just trying to work out how to connect up these lighting triangles in a way that looks nice. Obviously, it's personal preference. You could put them on the bottom, just above the PSU, or run them along the side. In the previous build that I did, I actually ended up running them along the sort of panel at the bottom. But here I thought it'd be nice to have them running up from the bottom of the case along the side there, and just by the fans, you can see some nice lighting. Now, I would recommend turning the power on for your case. If you've set everything up nicely, it should then all work, and then you can put the triangles together, because what you might find is sometimes the connections aren't working properly. You go to turn on your PC and some of them aren't powered, and so you can just adjust these fairly easily and just work out the logic of it. Now, they are magnetic, so they do get held in place. However, if you do bump the case around, you might find that they fall off. The other thing that I didn't think about was when installing the GPU, I'm now covering over some of those triangles. So maybe position a bit more towards the front. It's going to depend on the size of your GPU, obviously. But I am now blocking off some of the triangle view. But this is the Gigabyte 4070 Ti. I've done a review video on this separately. But it's a nice GPU and quite chunky beast. But I also have tested, if you're curious, 4090 will fit in here as well. So it will take a full 4090 in this case without a problem. I'm using the new style of PCIe Gen 5 cable for this. So it has that single connector. And obviously this is that premium sleeved cable from Corsair as well. So that looks really nice. And then this is the end result that you saw at the beginning. It has some really nice lighting in it that's obviously controllable on IQ, and you have to go into the software and set it all up. But you can tweak the pump head. You can have different displays on there as well. You've got RGB lighting on all the fans and obviously on the accent triangles, and really stylish. Now, the good news is, fortunately, you can still just close the door on the rear. So there's a lot of cables back there. I thought I did a reasonably good job of tidying them up, but there's still so much going on that is still looks a bit problematic. I know it's not perfect cable management. I've never done perfect cable management, usually because I'll have to take this apart at some point and rebuild it in a different case or do something else with it, so I don't go over the top with it in terms of the cable looping. But the good news is, even if you are like me and you do have a mess, you can just force those doors on and they do close really nicely without bulging out. So there's plenty of space back there for your cable shame. The case obviously has also removable cover on the front and dust trays there, so you've got an easy ability to clean this in future, and from multiple angles it looks really nice. Now, as I said, this RGB build was for a specific purpose. It's not just to do this video. I also am going to be doing some other content on what you can do with Corsair's RGB and how that's going to look. So subscribe if you haven't already. And if you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, please let me know in the comments. Any interaction, thumbs up, comments, whatever else really helps with engagement and boosting up my video and the algorithm, so that'd be greatly appreciated. Thanks very much for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Be sure to check out the links in the description to find out more on each of these parts and detailed guides on the setup if you need it. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.